He just wanted a $7 coffee, but she looked at him and said something no one had ever dared to say before. The soft hum of grinders and quiet chatter filled the small downtown cafe, sunlight slipping through the front windows and catching on chipped wooden tables that had seen better days, the kind of place where people came to disappear, not to be noticed, and certainly not to change their lives. Lily Carter didn't belong to the silence today, not with the weight pressing on her chest, not with the overdue rent notice folded in her apron pocket, not with the ache in her feet after a double shift that hadn't even ended yet. She wiped down the counter, her fingers moving on autopilot, her mind somewhere else entirely, somewhere between the version of her life she had and the one she kept sketching in the margins of her notebook, the one where she wasn't just serving coffee but building something of her own, something that mattered. The bell above the door chimed softly, and she glanced up without thinking, expecting another order she could recite before they even spoke, but instead, she saw him. He didn't look like much at first glance, just another guy in a dark jacket that had seen a little wear, hair slightly out of place, eyes tired in a way that didn't come from physical labor but from something heavier, something internal. He stepped inside like he didn't quite belong anywhere, not even here, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Lily grabbed a menu out of habit, forcing a small smile as she approached. "What can I get started for you?" she asked, her voice steady even though her mind was racing through everything else she needed to do. He hesitated, glancing at the menu like it was written in another language, then exhaled quietly. "Just coffee," he said, almost apologetically, like he didn't want to take up more space than necessary. Lily nodded, already turning toward the machine, but something about the way he said it made her pause, just for a second, like there was more behind that simple request, like coffee wasn't really what he came here for. She poured the cup, the rich aroma rising in the air, grounding her for a brief moment, and when she set it in front of him, she noticed the way his phone lit up, a name flashing across the screen before he quickly turned it over, but not fast enough. She caught a glimpse, just enough to register tension in his expression, just enough to hear the edge in his voice when he answered, stepping slightly aside but not far enough to disappear. "No," he said under his breath, controlled but firm. "That's not the problem. The numbers work. They always worked." A pause, his jaw tightening. "Then what is it?" Another pause, longer this time, and Lily didn't mean to listen, she really didn't, but the cafe was quiet, and his frustration filled the space like a second voice. "Because no one believes in it," he said finally, softer now, almost to himself, and something about that line, something about the way it landed, made her chest tighten unexpectedly, because she knew that feeling, she lived in that feeling. He ended the call, staring at the coffee like it had betrayed him, like it was just another reminder that nothing was going the way it was supposed to, and before Lily could stop herself, before she could think about how inappropriate it was or how badly it could go, she spoke. "Maybe it's not your money," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet, surprising even herself, and he looked up, caught off guard, eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in curiosity. She swallowed, her heart suddenly pounding, but she didn't back down, not this time. "Maybe it's your idea." The words hung between them, fragile and dangerous, and for a second, the entire cafe seemed to hold its breath. The moment the words left her mouth, Lily felt it, that sharp drop in her stomach, like she had just stepped off something too high without looking down first, and for a second she wished she could take it back, pretend she had never said anything at all, go back to being invisible behind the counter, but it was too late now because he was looking at her, really looking this time, not like a customer scanning a name tag or waiting for a refill, but like someone trying to figure out if what he had just heard was real. His eyes held on hers a second longer. Then comfortable, then he leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with a quiet intensity that made her fingers tighten around the edge of the counter. "That is a bold thing to say to a stranger," he said finally, his voice calm but edged with something unreadable, not offended, not amused, just curious. Lily forced herself to breathe, lifting her chin just a little, even though her heart was racing. "You sounded like you needed someone to say it," she replied, softer now but steady, and there was a flicker of something in his expression, something that shifted, like a door opening just a crack. He glanced down at his coffee, then back at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet hum of the cafe filling the space again, but now it felt different, heavier, charged. "And you think you know what is wrong with my idea?" he asked, not dismissive, not challenging, just inviting. Lily hesitated, because this was the moment she usually backed out, the moment she reminded herself who she was and where she stood, but today something felt different, like if she let this pass, she would regret it more than saying the wrong thing. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, worn notebook, the edges bent and pages filled with scribbles and half-formed thoughts, things she never expected anyone else to see, and she flipped it open quickly, scanning until she found a blank space. "I do not know your full idea," she admitted, grabbing a pen from behind her ear, "but I know this," she added, her voice gaining a quiet confidence as she turned the notebook toward him. "People do not invest in numbers first, they invest in clarity, in story, in something they can believe in." He leaned forward slightly, his attention locked on the page as she began sketching, her hand moving faster now, like it finally had permission to do what it had been waiting to do all along. "If they are saying no, it is not because your idea is bad," she continued, drawing quick lines and arrows, building something simple but structured. "It is because they do not understand why it matters." She paused just long enough to look up at him, searching his expression. Then pointed to the page. "You are trying to sell the outcome," she said, tapping one corner, "but you are not showing them the problem clearly enough. You are skipping the part where they feel it." The cafe noise faded again, or maybe it just stopped mattering, because he was completely still now, his eyes moving across the page, following her logic, his mind clearly working through something deeper than the conversation they were having. "And you figured all of that out while working here?" he asked quietly, not mocking, just genuinely asking, and Lily gave a small, almost embarrassed shrug. "I think about things," she said simply, then added with a faint smile, "probably more than I should." He let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, and shook his head slightly, like he was recalibrating something inside himself. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lily," she replied. He nodded slowly, repeating it once under his breath like he was committing it to memory. "Lily," he said again, then glanced down at the notebook, at the rough sketch that had somehow managed to stop him in his tracks. "You might be the first person who has made me question my own idea in a long time." Lily felt her pulse quicken again, not from fear this time, but from something else, something unfamiliar but unmistakable, like the first hint that maybe, just maybe, she was not as invisible as she had always believed. Ethan did not reach for the notebook right away, and that hesitation said more than anything he could have said out loud, because for the first time in a long time, he was not certain of his own thinking, not certain of the structure he had spent months defending in boardrooms filled with people who nodded but never truly believed, and now here he was, sitting across from a waitress in a quiet cafe, staring at a few lines of ink that somehow made more sense than all the polished presentations he had paid thousands of dollars to produce. He finally picked it up, his fingers brushing lightly over the page as if he expected it to disappear. Then he looked back at her, really looked this time, taking in the details he had ignored when he first walked in, the slightly worn apron, the ink stain near her thumb, the tiredness in her eyes that did not hide the sharpness behind them. "Walk me through it," he said, his voice lower now, more focused, and Lily felt a shift, subtle but undeniable, like the ground beneath her had just changed direction. She nodded, stepping around the counter despite knowing she probably should not leave her station, but no one stopped her, and for once she did not stop herself either. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, the notebook between them, her pen tapping lightly against the page as she gathered her thoughts. "You said the numbers work," she began, glancing at him briefly before pointing to the diagram she had drawn, "which means the foundation is there, but you are presenting it like a finished product instead of a journey." He leaned in closer, his attention fixed, and she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "People need to see how it starts, where it struggles, where it almost fails, and then how it wins. That is what makes them believe it can actually happen." She drew another line, connecting two parts of the sketch. "Right now, you are asking them to trust you at the end without letting them walk with you through the beginning." Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand moving to his chin as he processed what she was saying, and for a moment he forgot where he was, forgot the cafe, forgot the noise, because this was clarity, raw and unpolished but undeniably real. "And you think this would change their decision?" he asked, not skeptical, but careful, like someone testing the weight of something new. Lily hesitated just long enough to choose her words, then nodded. "I think it would change how they feel," she said, "and that is what changes decisions." Silence settled between them again, but it was not awkward this time. It was full, like something important had just been placed on the table and neither of them wanted to rush past it. A voice called out from behind the counter, snapping Lily back to reality, and she turned quickly, realizing how long she had been sitting there. "I should get back," she said, standing up and brushing her hands lightly against her apron, but she did not move away just yet. Ethan closed the notebook slowly, his thumb resting on the edge of the page he had filled, and for a second it looked like he was about to say something else, something bigger, but instead he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, placing them on the table without counting. "Keep the change," he said, then added after a brief pause, "and the notebook, do not lose it." Lily let out a small breath, almost a laugh, shaking her head slightly. "I was not planning to," she replied, but her voice carried something new now, something lighter. He stood up, slipping his phone back into his pocket, and for a moment he hesitated again, like he was deciding whether to walk away or stay just a little longer, but then he gave a small nod, almost to himself, and turned toward the door. The bell chimed softly as he stepped outside, disappearing into the late afternoon light, and Lily stood there for a second longer than she needed to, her eyes lingering on the empty space he had left behind. She picked up the notebook, tracing the line she had drawn, and for the first time in a long time, they did not feel like just ideas anymore, they felt like something real, something that had been seen. The next morning came too early, like it always did, but something felt different before Lily even opened her eyes, a strange mix of restlessness and anticipation that she could not quite explain, and for a moment she just lay there on the narrow couch she had claimed as her bed, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling above her, replaying the conversation from the day before in fragments that refused to settle. It had been just a conversation, she told herself, just a customer passing through, someone she would probably never see again, and yet the way he had listened, really listened, had left something behind that would not go away. She sat up slowly, running a hand through her hair, then reached for the notebook resting on the small table beside her, flipping it open to the page she had filled, her handwriting rushed but clear enough to bring it all back in an instant. For a second, doubt crept in, quiet but familiar. What if she had overstepped? What if she had been wrong? What if he had walked out thinking she was just another person talking too much without understanding anything at all? She closed the notebook quickly, as if that thought alone might undo whatever had happened, and pushed herself to her feet, already late, already moving. The cafe looked exactly the same when she arrived, same worn tables, same soft light filtering through the windows, same low hum of early customers starting their day, and for a moment she almost laughed at herself for expecting anything different, because of course nothing had changed, nothing ever did, not here. She tied her apron, stepped behind the counter, and fell into the rhythm she knew too well, taking orders, pouring coffee, offering small smiles that came automatically, but every time the bell above the door chimed, her eyes flicked up before she could stop them, just for a second, just long enough to check, and every time it was someone else. By late morning, she told herself to stop, to focus, to let it go, because that was how things worked. People came and went, conversations faded, and life stayed exactly where it was, steady and predictable. Then the door opened again, the bell ringing a little sharper this time, and without thinking she looked up, already expecting disappointment, but instead she froze. It was him. He stepped inside like he had not quite decided whether he should be there, his gaze scanning the room before landing on her, and for a brief moment something almost like relief crossed his face, quick enough that she might have imagined it. Lily felt her pulse jump, her hands suddenly unsure of what they were doing as she set down the cup she had been holding. He walked up to the counter, slower this time, more deliberate, like he was stepping into something he had already thought through more than once. "Good morning," he said, and there was something different in his tone now, something steadier, more certain, but also more open. Lily blinked, then gave a small nod, forcing her voice to cooperate. "Morning," she replied, trying to sound normal, like this was just another day, just another order. He glanced briefly at the menu, then back at her, and for a second the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I think I will have the same," he said, and she almost smiled, because of course he would. She turned to prepare the coffee, her movements a little faster than usual, her mind already racing ahead, wondering why he had come back, what he was going to say, if anything at all. When she set the cup down in front of him, he did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he pulled something from his jacket pocket and placed it gently on the counter between them. It was a folded piece of paper, slightly worn at the edges, and when she recognized it, her breath caught just a little. It was the page from her notebook, the one she had filled the day before. He slid it toward her, his fingers lingering for just a second before letting go. "I could not stop thinking about this," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers again, and this time there was no hesitation in them, only intent. "So I made a few changes." Lily stared at the paper for a second longer than she meant to, her fingers hovering just above it as if touching it too quickly might somehow change what she was seeing, because the rough sketch she had made the day before was still there, but it was no longer just hers. New lines had been added, cleaner, sharper, extending her idea into something that looked real, something structured, something that felt like it could exist beyond the pages of a notebook. She slowly picked it up, unfolding it carefully, her eye scanning every detail, every adjustment, every connection he had built on top of her original thought, and without realizing it, she leaned slightly closer, completely absorbed. "You worked on this?" she asked quietly, almost as if she needed to confirm it out loud, and he nodded once, watching her reaction closely, not with pride, but with something closer to anticipation. "All night," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made her glance up, surprised. "And you were right." The words landed softly but firmly, and for a moment Lily did not know what to say, because people did not usually come back to tell her she was right. They did not usually come back at all. She looked back down at the page, her mind catching up with what she was seeing, and slowly, almost instinctively, she reached for a pen again. "This part," she said, pointing to a section he had restructured, "you simplified the entry point. That is good, it makes it easier to understand, but you might be losing the emotional hook here." He leaned in immediately, his attention locking onto the exact place she indicated, and without hesitation, she began to adjust it, her pen moving with more confidence now, refining what he had built, layering her instinct on top of his logic. "If you bring this back," she continued, sketching a quick line to reconnect the earlier concept, "you give them a reason to care before you ask them to believe." Ethan watched her in silence, but there was nothing passive about it, his focus intense, absorbing every word, every movement, and for the first time in a long time, he was not leading the conversation, he was following it. "You do this often?" he asked after a moment, not interrupting her flow but genuinely curious, and Lily gave a small shrug, not looking up. "In my head," she admitted, a faint smile touching her lips, "mostly when I should be sleeping." He let out a quiet breath, almost amused, but there was something else beneath it, something more serious, something that was starting to take shape. "You should not be doing this just in your head," he said, and the simplicity of the statement made her pause, her pen hovering above the page again. She looked up at him, searching his expression, trying to understand what he meant, but he did not elaborate right away. Instead, he reached for the paper again, studying the new version they had just created together. "This," he added, tapping the page lightly, "this is not small thinking." Lily felt a strange warmth rise in her chest, unexpected and unfamiliar, and she quickly looked away, pretending to focus on straightening the edge of the paper. "It is just an idea," she said, almost dismissively, because that was safer, that was what she had always told herself. Ethan shook his head slightly, his gaze steady. "No," he replied, more firmly now, "it is a foundation." The word lingered between them, heavier than it should have been, and for a moment Lily forgot where she was again, forgot the cafe, forgot the noise, forgot everything except the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about herself all along. A customer's voice broke through the moment, calling her name from across the room, and she blinked, the reality of her surroundings rushing back in all at once. She straightened quickly, stepping back behind the counter, but her eyes kept drifting to the paper still in his hands, to the version of her idea that no longer felt like something she had to hide. Ethan folded it carefully, this time with intention, and slipped it back into his jacket, but before he stepped away, he looked at her again, his expression unreadable for just a second before it settled into something clear. "I will be back," he said simply, and this time, it did not sound like a casual promise, it sounded like a decision. He did not come back the next day, and Lily told herself that it did not matter, that people said things all the time without meaning them, that promises could be as light as air when spoken in passing, but the absence still settled quietly into her routine, noticeable in the small moments she could not ignore, like when the bell above the door chimed and her eyes lifted without permission, or when she reached for her notebook and found herself staring at the page they had worked on together. Instead of writing anything new, the cafe moved on the way it always did, steady and indifferent, customers coming and going, orders stacking up, conversations blending into background noise, but something in her focus had shifted, something she could not quite push back into place. By the third day, she stopped expecting him entirely, or at least she told herself she did, forcing her attention back into the rhythm of work, into the certainty of things she could control, because that was safer than waiting for something that might never return. That afternoon, just as the lunch rush began to thin out and the light outside softened into that quiet, late-day glow, her phone buzzed in the pocket of her apron, a rare occurrence that immediately pulled her attention away from the counter. She hesitated for a second before stepping aside, pulling it out and glancing at the screen, her brow furrowing slightly at the unknown number. She almost ignored it, almost slipped it back into her pocket, but something stopped her, something small but persistent, and she answered. "Hello," she said cautiously, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear as she moved closer to the wall to hear better. There was a brief pause on the other end, then his voice came through, unmistakable even through the distance. "Lily," he said, and just hearing her name in his voice sent a quiet jolt through her chest. She straightened slightly, her grip tightening around the phone. "You disappeared," she replied before she could stop herself, the words slipping out softer than she intended, but he did not seem surprised. "I had to," he said, and there was something different in his tone now, something more serious, more focused than before. "I needed to test something." Lily frowned slightly, confusion mixing with a flicker of concern. "Test what?" she asked, glancing back toward the counter where another customer was waiting, but unable to pull herself away just yet. There was another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his words were measured, deliberate. "Your idea," he said. Her breath caught, just for a second, and she leaned slightly against the wall, trying to steady herself. "You tested it," she repeated, as if saying it out loud might help it make more sense. "I ran a small version of it," he explained, "just enough to see if the shift you suggested would change the response." Lily felt her heart start to race, her mind already jumping ahead, trying to fill in the gaps, trying to imagine what that even looked like, because this was no longer just a conversation, no longer just ink on paper, this was something moving, something happening in the real world. "And?" she asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. There was a subtle change in his breathing, like he was about to say something that mattered. "It worked," he said simply. The words landed with more weight than she expected, and for a moment everything around her seemed to fade, the noise, the movement, the cafe itself, all of it slipping into the background as she tried to process what he had just said. "What do you mean it worked?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I mean," he continued, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, the same people who said no before asked for a second meeting. Lily closed her eyes for just a second, her hand pressing lightly against her forehead, because this was not supposed to happen. Ideas like hers were not supposed to step outside of notebooks, they were not supposed to change anything real. That is not possible," she said softly, but even as she said it, she knew it was, because he would not be calling if it was not. "It is," he replied, steady and certain, "and it is only the beginning." There was a brief silence between them again, but this time it was filled with something entirely new, something that felt like possibility, like the first step into a life she had never allowed herself to imagine. "I need to see you," he added, and the urgency in his voice was impossible to ignore. "Not here, not like this, somewhere we can actually talk." Lily opened her eyes, her reflection faintly visible in the glass beside her, and for the first time, she did not just see a waitress looking back, she saw someone standing at the edge of something much bigger. Lily agreed before she had time to overthink it, the word yes leaving her lips quietly but firmly, and for the rest of her shift, everything felt slightly out of focus, like she was moving through a version of her life that no longer fit the same way it had just days ago, every sound a little distant, every motion a little automatic, because her mind kept circling back to one thing: it worked, the idea worked. And that single fact refused to settle into something normal. She met him that evening just after sunset, the the city air cooler now, carrying the low hum of traffic and distant voices, and when she stepped onto the sidewalk outside the address he had sent, she hesitated for just a moment, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag as she looked up at the building in front of her. It was not just another cafe or quiet corner spot, it was glass and steel, clean lines stretching upward, the kind of place that made her feel small before she even stepped inside. She almost turned around, almost told herself this was not her world, but then she remembered the notebook, the line she had drawn, the way he had said it is only the beginning, and she pushed the door open. The lobby was quiet, polished floors reflecting soft lighting, and for a second she felt completely out of place, until she saw him. He was standing near the far side of the room, not in the worn jacket she had first seen him in, but in something sharper now, tailored, precise, like the version of him she had not been shown before was no longer hidden. He turned when he saw her, and the expression on his face shifted instantly, something softer replacing the distance she had noticed before. "You came," he said, and there was something genuine in the way he said it, like it had mattered more than he expected. Lily nodded, taking a few steps closer, her eyes briefly scanning the space again before settling on him. "You said it was important," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady, even though everything around her felt unfamiliar. He studied her for a second, as if deciding how much to say, then gestured toward a quiet seating area nearby. "Sit," he said, not commanding, just direct, and she followed, lowering herself into the chair across from him, her posture careful, her attention fixed. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but loaded, like something significant was about to be said and neither of them wanted to rush it. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his gaze steady. "What I told you on the phone," he began, "that was just the surface." Lily felt her breath catch again, her fingers curling slightly in her lap as she waited. "The change you suggested did not just get us another meeting," he continued, his voice calm but carrying a quiet intensity, it shifted the entire direction of the conversation. She blinked, trying to process the scale of what he was saying, because this was no longer small, no longer theoretical, this was something real moving in a world she had never touched. "I presented it differently," he added, "exactly how you said, starting with the problem, letting them feel it, walking them through it." He paused, watching her reaction closely. "And for the first time, they did not just listen," he said, "they leaned in." Lily exhaled slowly, her mind racing to catch up, because this was not supposed to happen to her, not from a conversation over coffee, not from a few lines in a notebook. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked finally, her voice quieter now, more cautious, because there was something else here, something she had not yet understood. Ethan held her gaze, and for a second, the room seemed to narrow to just the space between them. "Because this is where I stop pretending," he said, and the words landed differently, heavier than anything he had said before. Lily frowned slightly, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, leaning forward just a little. He did not look away this time, not even for a second. "I am not just someone testing an idea," he said, his tone steady, deliberate, "and this is not just a small project." He let the silence sit for a brief moment, long enough for her to feel the shift before he spoke again. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said, and even before he finished, something in the way he said it told her this was not just a name, it was a reveal. "And the company I have been building this for," he continued, his voice calm but undeniable now, "is worth more than you probably think." Lily felt her pulse spike, the pieces beginning to connect in a way that made everything around her feel suddenly unstable, because the man sitting across from her was not who she thought he was, not even close, and the idea she had shared so casually was no longer just an idea, it was part of something far bigger than she had ever imagined. The silence after his words did not feel empty, it felt heavy, like something had shifted so suddenly that the space around them had not caught up yet, and Lily sat there, completely still, her mind trying to rearrange everything she thought she understood about him. About the past few days, about the simple conversation that had somehow led her here. Ethan Cole. The name echoed in her thoughts, not because she recognized it right away, but because of the way he said it, calm, certain, like he was no longer holding anything back. She looked at him again, really looked this time, noticing details she had missed before, the precision in the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence that no longer felt like uncertainty but like restraint, like he had been choosing not to show it. "You let me think," she started, but the words did not fully form, because she was not even sure what she was accusing him of yet, only that something about it felt off. Ethan did not interrupt, did not rush to defend himself. He simply watched her, giving her the space to process, which somehow made it harder, not easier. "You let me think you were just someone with an idea," she finished, her voice quieter now, but edged with something sharper underneath. He nodded once, not denying it. "I did," he said, and there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften it, just honesty. That honesty landed harder than any excuse would have, and Lily leaned back slightly, her arms crossing without her realizing it, a small instinctive barrier forming between them. "Why?" she asked, and this time the question was clear, direct. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly to the table before returning to her. "Because I needed to know if what you saw was real," he said, his voice steady but lower now, more personal. "Not influenced by who I am, not shaped by what you think I have, just real." Lily let out a small breath, shaking her head slightly, because part of her understood that, part of her even respected it, but another part felt exposed in a way she had not agreed to. "So I was a test," she said, the words coming out flatter than she expected, and he leaned forward immediately, his expression tightening just enough to show that was not how he wanted her to see it. "No," he said firmly, "you were not a test, the idea was the test." She held his gaze, searching for anything that felt untrue, but there was nothing in his expression that suggested he was lying, and that only made it more complicated. "Do you realize how this sounds?" she asked, her voice soft but unwavering, because this was not just about the idea anymore, it was about her, about the way she had stepped into something without knowing the full picture. "You walked into a cafe, let me talk, let me think I was helping someone who needed it, and all along you," she stopped, unable to finish the sentence in a way that made sense even to herself. Ethan did not interrupt, did not try to fill in the silence, he simply listened, and when she finally looked back at him, he spoke again, slower this time, more deliberate. "All along, I was trying to find something real in a world where everything is usually calculated," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, no sense of superiority, just something honest, almost tired. Lily's expression shifted slightly, the tension still there but no longer as sharp, because she recognized that feeling too, even if it came from a very different place. "And you found it," she said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement. He nodded once, his eyes not leaving hers. "I did," he replied, and the simplicity of it made her look away for a second, her thoughts moving faster than she could sort them. She stood up slowly, needing a moment to breathe, to step away from the weight of what he had just revealed, and walked a few steps toward the glass wall overlooking the city, the lights outside beginning to flicker on as evening settled in. "This is not my world," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, almost to herself, but he heard it. "It was not mine either," he replied from behind her, his tone just as quiet, "not in the way you think." She turned back to him then, her expression no longer defensive, but uncertain, caught between the life she knew and the one that was suddenly standing in front of her, asking her to step into it. "Then why does it feel like everything just changed?" she asked, and this time there was no edge in her voice, only honesty. Ethan met her halfway, not closing the distance completely, but enough that his presence felt steady, not overwhelming. "Because it did," he said simply, and for the first time since he revealed who he was, there was no distance between the truth and the moment they were standing in. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the quiet hum of the building wrapping around them like a pause that neither wanted to break too quickly, because something important had already been said, something that could not be taken back or reshaped into something simpler, and Lily stood there, feeling the weight of it settle into her chest, not as pressure, but as a choice. She looked out at the city again, the lights stretching endlessly, each one representing a life, a decision, a path taken or left behind, and for the first time, she did not feel separated from it, she felt like she was standing just at the edge of stepping into it. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, turning back to him, her voice steady but honest, because she was no longer pretending this was something small. Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because he understood that the answer mattered, that it could not be rushed or framed in a way that felt transactional. He took a step closer, closing the distance just enough to make the moment feel grounded. "That depends on you," he said, and there was no pressure in his tone, no expectation, just clarity. Lily let out a slow breath, her fingers relaxing at her sides as she searched his face, looking for anything that suggested this was another test, another layer she had not seen yet, but there was nothing hidden now, only intention. "You already proved the idea works," she said, her voice softer now. "You do not need me anymore." The words felt logical, safe, the kind of conclusion she had always reached when something started to feel too big, too uncertain, but Ethan shook his head slightly, a faint smile touching his expression, not dismissive, but understanding. "That is where you are wrong," he replied, his voice calm but certain. "The idea worked because of how you see things, not just what you wrote." He reached into his jacket then, pulling out the folded paper once more, the same one that had started everything, and held it between them for a second before handing it back to her. "This was never just about a strategy," he continued, "it was about perspective, and that is not something I can replicate without you." Lily looked down at the paper in her hands, the lines familiar now, but heavier with meaning, because they no longer represented a possibility, they represented a turning point. "So what are you asking?" she said, lifting her eyes back to his, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice, only readiness to hear the truth. Ethan met her gaze fully, no distance, no guarded edges left. "Come build it with me," he said simply, and the words landed exactly as they were meant to, direct, unfiltered, impossible to misunderstand. Lily felt her heart skip, not from fear this time, but from the realization of what he was offering, not just a job, not just an opportunity, but a place in something she had never believed she could be part of. "I do not have experience," she said automatically, the old doubts surfacing out of habit more than belief, but Ethan did not let them take hold. "You have something more valuable than experience," he replied, "you have clarity, and you have the courage to say it out loud." The simplicity of his words cut through everything else, leaving no space for the excuses she had used for so long, and for a moment she just stood there, holding the paper, holding the decision, feeling the weight of both. She thought about the cafe, the routine, the life she knew so well, and then she thought about the way it had felt when he said it worked, the way something inside her had shifted in a way she could not undo. Slowly, she nodded, not dramatically, not with hesitation, just once, but it was enough. "Okay," she said, and the word felt different than any she had said before, like it carried a future inside it. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, a small smile forming, not triumphant, but relieved, like something had finally aligned the way it was supposed to. "Then we start tomorrow," he said, and this time it did not sound like a plan, it sounded like the beginning of something real. Lily glanced down at the paper one last time, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her bag. Not as something to hide, but as something to carry forward, and as she looked back up at him, the distance between their worlds no longer felt like a barrier, it felt like a bridge that had just been built.